Good morning and welcome to today's Forum Assembly. My name is Brent Webb, and President Samuelson has asked me to conduct the forum today. We're delighted to hear today from Mr. Ron Chernow, a well-published Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His talk is entitled, Revealing the Elusive President, George Washington. Mr. Chernow is an honors graduate of Yale and Cambridge with a doctorate in English literature. He is one of the most distinguished commentators on politics, business, and finance in America today. His books, biographies of historical figures from the world of business, finance, and American politics, have received national recognition. As a freelance journalist, he has written over 60 articles in national publications. A frequent contributor to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Chernow is a familiar figure on national radio and television and has appeared in numerous documentaries. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and recently served as president of Pan American Center, the country's preeminent organization of authors. In recent years, he has received honorary doctorates from Marymount Manhattan College, Hamilton College, and Long Island University. In October 2010, Mr. Chernow's long-awaited biography of George Washington, entitled Washington, A Life, was published and has received critical acclaim. The book won the prestigious American History Book Prize in early 2011 and the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Ron Chernow.
I'm really thrilled and honored and touched to be here today to address you in this beautiful arena. It's my first time in Provo, Utah, and how could I not be struck by the spectacular scenery and situation that you're in. Now, in February 1789, in other words, right before he was inaugurated as our first president, George Washington received a fascinating letter from Europe written by his dear friend, Gouverneur Morris, who reported on the sudden madness of King George III. In the king's delirious state, Morris wrote, he had, quote, conceived himself to be no less a personage than George Washington marching at the head of the American army. And then Morris added facetiously to Washington, this delusion shows that you have done something or other which sticks most terribly in the king's stomach, which indeed Washington had. But who was this commoner George who had become such a legendary figure in his own time, and of course ever since, that he actually managed to invade the feverish dream world of the deranged Royal George across the ocean? Now, you may well feel that Washington is the most familiar figure in our history and that the nature of his personality was settled long ago by historians. But I came to doubt the received wisdom on Washington about 10 years ago. I was researching my biography of Alexander Hamilton, and I was poring over a series of letters that Hamilton wrote late in the Revolutionary War after he had a quarrel with Washington, a quarrel that led to Hamilton quitting his job as Washington's aide-de-camp and chief of staff. Now, in these letters, as you can imagine, Hamilton felt the need to defend this controversial decision before family and friends, and he portrayed George Washington as moody, irritable, and temperamental, even, dare I say, something of a powder-keg boss. As Hamilton wrote to his father-in-law with more than a touch of youthful bravado, the great man and I have come to an open rupture. He shall, for once at least, repent his ill humor. I could remember sitting there, ill humor? Did Hamilton mean to imply that this sulky, carping, rather difficult boss was the saintly father of our country, the man we like to think of as so cool and stoical and reserved? Of course, I hasten to add this was far from the whole truth about George Washington, And I hope that in my biography I have devoted sufficiently lavish praise to Washington's fortitude, his patriotism, his wisdom, his integrity, and 1,000 other outstanding traits. My aim in writing about Washington was not to debunk George Washington, far from it. In fact, what I was trying to do was actually to recreate the sense of charisma and magnetism that had so excited Washington's contemporaries, but that had somehow gotten lost in the translation to posterity. That's why I put it on the cover of the book, Washington and the White Horse. That was the way that his contemporaries liked to see him, as the heroic figure on horseback. Nevertheless, Hamilton tended to pen very perceptive word portraits about people, and his comments for me opened an unexpected window into a world of seething emotions swirling around inside George Washington. Emotions, of course, that Washington had learned to keep in check with his very formidable self-control. And what I slowly came to realize was that George Washington was not this bland figure, worthy but dull, that has somehow taken up residence in the American imagination. Let's face it, revolutionaries throughout history are not made of such tame stuff. And I came to see that the private Washington differed quite markedly from the public facade. There was always a furnace burning inside Washington, a furnace that his closest associates saw clearly, but that was kept carefully hidden from the outside world. Well, after 6 years of very intense work on this biography, I came to the conclusion that George Washington was a passionate, complex, sensitive man, a man of many, many moods, a man of fiery opinions, a fierce, hard-driving perfectionist who had learned to cloak this immense force of his personality behind that laconic facade that we all know so well. In part, I think, our misconception about Washington came about with his own tacit cooperation. Washington wanted to keep his inner self secretive and private. Washington equated silence with strength. He always felt that strength enabled him to keep his options open in life. But some of the misunderstanding, I think, comes from us, from our very laudable desire to revere and venerate the father of our country. You see, I think that in doing that, we've sanded down the rough edges of Washington's personality, and we've turned him into this impossibly stiff and lifeless figure, very much like, the full-length portrait of him by Gilbert Stuart. It hangs in the East Room of the White House, and Washington is standing there with his arm rigidly thrust ahead. Well, that portrait of the aging Washington, that wooden character that you see there, he could never have defeated the British Empire, which was the mightiest military machine of the 18th century. That wooden figure could never have presided over the often fractious and unruly Constitutional Convention. And that wooden figure could never have forged the office of the presidency. The man who accomplished all of those monumental feats, it stands to simple reason, must have been a real force of nature. Now, in order to fashion a brand new portrait of Washington, the poor biographer must begin by hacking his way with a very sharp machete through a very dense jungle of myths that has grown up around George Washington. Even well-educated Americans, I'm sorry to say, seem to find it difficult to cleanse their minds of all the preposterous stories that now cling to Washington's memory. So let me start out, if I may, by retiring some of the most egregious errors about Washington, however trivial they may seem to you at first glance. Okay, let's get the cherry tree story right out of the way. This bit of sheer nonsense was invented after Washington's death by a man named Parson Mason Locke Weems. Weems was an itinerant preacher and book peddler with an eye on the main chance. You see, what happened after Washington died in December 1799, the public was famished for personal stories of Washington's life. Stories, I must say, that Washington had studiously withheld from them. And so Parson Weems rushed to fill the vacuum with outright fabrications. The cherry tree story, I think, has been particularly destructive, not only because it has been used to terrorize generations of American school children. I think we can all recall a moment in our childhood when we were maybe 4 or 5 years old and some adult authority figure was suddenly wagging a finger in our face and saying, Ronald George Washington would not have told that lie. But I think it's also been destructive because it creates a very misleading image of Washington as a kind of cold and priggish character when he was really anything but. Another common myth, again, I apologize for some of these trivialities, the wooden teeth. This has always struck me as a particularly strange myth because wood obviously would have rotted in his mouth from digestive enzymes within a matter of days and weeks. Okay, so how did this whole thing come about? Well, by the time Washington became president, he had only a single tooth left in his mouth. He said that he used to crack nuts as a young man, and this is how he lost his teeth. Whatever the case, by the time he became president, he had only one tooth left in his mouth. It was a very brave and a very, very, very lonely lower left bicuspid. Now, his upper and lower dentures were both anchored by that solitary tooth. There still exist several sets of his dentures. I examined one pair in New York, the New York Academy of Medicine Library, and let me tell you, they were ungainly, medieval-looking contraptions. They were painful for me as his biographer to examine, and even much more painful, I'm sure, for Washington to wear. They would have been rubbing relentlessly all day against his raw gums. The frames were carved, not from wood, but from walrus or elephant ivory. We're not exactly sure which. And they had actual human teeth inserted into them. Believe it or not, it was a common practice in the 18th century for people to purchase teeth. This sounds ghoulish, but dentists would typically advertise for teeth in the newspapers. Now, as those ivory frames aged and stained, they developed a grainy look that to later generations resembled wood. Hence the historic misunderstanding that neither I nor any of my predecessors can seem to banish. I don't know why, but the human mind seems to cling much more tenaciously to these fictions than to fact, something that I'm sure has struck anyone who has written history for a living. Incidentally, when I was examining those dentures, I discovered something that I think must have had a direct impact on Washington's presidency. The upper and lower dentures were connected in the back by curved metal springs. There were no adhesives of the sort we have today. So in order to keep them in his mouth, Washington always had to keep his lips firmly compressed. This meant that every time he opened his mouth to speak, it would relax the pressure on the springs, and there was the distinct possibility that the presidential dentures would suddenly come flying out of the presidential mouth. This, I think, may help to explain the strange brevity of Washington's speeches as president, which were only often 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs in length. Okay, another misconception about Washington, one that I find almost universal. Everyone seems to think that he wore a wig, but I found no evidence that he ever wore a wig. I found no evidence that he ever had even put on a wig. So how on earth, you're wondering, did he get that distinctive Washington hairdo? Well, he fluffed out the hair in twin wings on either side. I don't know how he got the hair to stand out horizontally like that. He sprinkled gray powder on top, very common in the 18th century. If you look closely at some of the Gilbert Stuart portraits, you can see a fine gray powder on the shoulders of his black velvet suit. That wasn't dandruff, that was actually Stuart noting how the gray hair powder had drifted down. And then Washington pulled back the remaining hair in a style that we would call a ponytail, but that the much more formal 18th century called a queue. Now, to our eyes, that hairstyle may look rather fussy or quaint, but believe it or not, in the 18th century, that style of the queue, the ponytail, which was then knotted in a big black satin bow at the nape, that was considered the manly military look. So assuming that there was anyone in America who didn't know who George Washington was but saw him walking down the street, they would look at his hair and say, there goes a military man. Finally, everyone repeats ad nauseum that George Washington was 6'2", 6'3", or 6'3.5". He seems to grow with each retelling. Being a dutiful historian, I discovered it rests on a single piece of evidence. When Washington was measured, his cadaver was measured for its coffin, he measured exactly 6'3.5". Well, you're thinking that would seem to settle the matter, right? Wrong. I want you all to try an experiment when you get back to your rooms this evening. Lie down on your bed, on your back, and just relax. You'll see that your feet will fall forward, your toes will point outward. Throw in rigor mortis, you just have added 2 or 3 inches to your height. I'm an obsessive type. I became obsessed with this question when I was writing the book, and I collected nearly 40 comments from Washington contemporaries who commented on his height in letters and diaries, and in 35 out of the 40 cases, they pegged his height at exactly 6 feet. But then there came the clincher. Before the Revolutionary War, Washington, like many of the Virginia planters, used to order all his clothing from London. So he had to sit down every 6 months, and he had to not only describe the clothing in detail, but he had to describe his physique in detail. And every 6 months, he tells his London tailor that he's a man exactly 6 feet tall. Now, we all know the one person you can't lie to about your height, unless you want to look like a complete laughingstock, is your London tailor. So I think we can consider the case closed. Washington was 6 feet tall, which was still relatively tall for the time, although Jefferson was probably an inch or two taller. Now, some of these things may seem amusing but frivolous, the fascinating minutiae of American history. But I'm trying to give you a sense of the thoroughgoing skepticism that any conscientious biographer must bring to the task of stalking George Washington. You have to start out by scrubbing from your mind all preconceptions and try to open yourself up completely to the facts. And if you do so, I think you will find someone who deviates in significant ways from the many historical stereotypes attached to the man. You also begin to realize, and this is very important in writing a biography, that no subject is a finished study but a work in progress. You're trying to capture the person not being that historic personage, but becoming that historic personage. Obviously, George Washington, the way we imagine him in later years, he was not born that way. People often say to me, well, what was George Washington really like? And I'm always tempted to reply, well, at what time in his life, during what event in his life? He was a man, and this was his blessing. He was constantly growing and changing and deepening as a human being. He was already something of a prodigy in his 20s. He fought for 5 years in the wilderness in the French and Indian War out in the so-called Ohio country. This would have been southwest Pennsylvania, West Virginia, eastern Ohio. By the age of 23, this wunderkind commanded all of the armed forces in Virginia. And mind you, this at a time when Virginia was then the most powerful and populous of all the colonies. His perseverance and bravery were already the stuff of legend. But you shouldn't picture this younger Washington as some junior version of the older, wiser, and more vulnerable Washington of the Gilbert Stuart years. The young Washington could be dogged, and even sometimes rather crass in his pursuit of money, status, and power. Interestingly enough, he first rebels against the British, not for idealistic reasons, but for purely personal reasons. The British had denied him the Royal Commission and the regular army that he coveted. The British had sold his tobacco in London for what he considered inferior prices, and then they turned around and sold him shoddy, overpriced goods in return. At the end of the French and Indian War, the British banned settlements west of the Allegheny Mountains, thus thwarting Washington's already avid real estate ambitions. He would eventually collect 40 to 50,000 acres of land. The British were simply bad for business. The British were bad for your career. Had Washington died at this point in his life, he would have been no more than a mere footnote at best, however remarkable a young man he was. Now, in Washington's defense, we have to say that his early years were very troubled ones. His father, Gus, died when George was only 11. Gus had been a farmer. He also had managed an iron furnace and owned iron ore properties. George seemed to have very hazy memories, very positive memories of him. When Gus died when George was 11, he left George to the tender mercies of his mother, Mary Ball Washington, who was something of a terror. She was a self-centered, difficult, domineering woman. Believe it or not, she took no apparent pride or pleasure in her son's career. She had more to boast about than any other mother in American history, I would say, but she never did. Believe it or not, we have no evidence that she attended the wedding of George and Martha Washington at Mount Vernon. We have no evidence that she ever visited them at Mount Vernon, even though she lived in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is not really that far away. Historic rumor, believe it or not, has even pegged her as a possible Tory during the Revolutionary War. She always felt George was her eldest son, eldest of 6 children, and very capable. She always felt that George was neglecting her in favor of his own career. One of my favorite stories, during the French and Indian War, when George was a young colonel commanding 1,000 soldiers, Mary Washington suddenly sent him an urgent message that she needed a new Dutch servant and some butter, as if he was supposed to, on the spot, drop all of his regimental duties and go fetch his mother some butter. Now, later on, during the Revolutionary War, Washington learned that his mother had filed a petition with the Virginia legislature asking for emergency relief. She claimed poverty and hinted at neglect by you-know-who. Nobody in Richmond, then the Virginia state capital, nobody in Richmond dared to tell Washington for 2 full months before the Speaker of the Assembly finally got up the courage to do so. And of course, when Washington found out what his mother had done, he was absolutely livid. He had been an extraordinarily generous son. He had bought his mother a lovely house and garden downtown Fredericksburg. The house still stands there. He'd given her lots and lots of money as either loans or outright gifts, and this was the repayment he received. And there was no pleasing Mary Washington. In the book, I speculate that the first and perhaps greatest general Washington ever encountered was his own mother, and that he learned to govern his considerable temper in dealing with her strange and always capricious moods. I think that his overly controlled personality, the one that I was saying earlier has misled historians, I think that overly controlled personality probably came about in his constant efforts to deal with his mother's moods. Now, with this very difficult mother, and as I said, no father on the scene, it's not surprising that the young George Washington was something less than a paragon, or that his dreams of cutting a figure in Virginia society were still fairly conventional dreams. But then in the mid-1760s, with the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, something miraculous begins to happen in this life. Washington comes to realize that his private grievances merely reflect a larger public problem, and that the British Empire has actually stacked the deck against all the colonists. The personal becomes intensely political, as Washington sees that his long-standing frustrations are suddenly and rather gloriously transmuted into universal principles of justice. It's at this point that Washington begins to find his own political voice, and that voice was a strong and militant one. I think if ever there was a man who was ennobled by circumstances, if ever there was a man who was fired up by a righteous cause, that man was George Washington, who transcended his origins in a way only matched in our history, of course, by Abraham Lincoln. It's in the political struggle against the crown that Washington suddenly learns to breathe a purer air, which helps to purge away the sometimes unattractive egotism and self-interest that marred the character of the young Washington. Now, it must be said, Washington, during the Revolutionary War, he was only a middling general. Believe it or not, he lost more battles than he won. Yet I think this is one of those rare cases in history where you can't judge a general by the usual scorecard of battles lost and won. Because this was one time where arguably what happened between battles was more important than what happened on the battlefield itself. You see, I think by strength of will, by force of character, by clarity of vision, by tenacity of purpose, George Washington single-handedly held that threadbare Continental Army and hence the American cause together. And he had to do so despite constant nerve-wracking shortages of men, money, gunpowder, shoes, blankets, you name it. And all the while, think of the political task that he had to master. He had to juggle 14 different political bosses. There was the eternally squabbling Continental Congress, as well as 13 state governors. And Washington did an extraordinary job. Remember, he was really functioning as the de facto president already during the war. We had this squabbling Congress, but we had no independent executive branch. We had no judicial branch. So in the eyes of the world, Washington was effectively chief of state. Nobody but George Washington could have had the courage and the fortitude to endure 8.5 years of unspeakable misery as he struggled to keep this ragged army intact. If you doubt that there's at least a grain of truth to the great man or great woman theory of history, just read about Washington's life and try to figure out who else might have stepped into his shoes. All the other generals, and some of them were very talented, they were all sidetracked by petty bickering and jockeying for power. It's only Washington who keeps his eye on the ball. It's Washington who has the inspired simplicity of vision to see the job through. Now, this was a very complicated man, in some ways a very enigmatic man. But when it came to these supreme quests that defined his life, he had a focus and a discipline and a drive that were truly unique. Washington, thank God, lives up to his enormous reputation. And some of the other founders, they were maybe more dazzling figures intellectually, but in terms of perseverance and fortitude in achieving a goal, Washington had no peer. He also displayed a genius for leadership. Washington can make the lowliest grunts in the Continental Army feel as if they were major actors in an epic pageant for liberty, which in fact they were. He always urged his men to live up to the highest moral standards, never cut ethical corners. He issued in his daily orders, he pleaded with his men to give up drinking, gambling, swearing. He implored them to protect individual liberties, beseeched them to respect private property, even during that grim winter at Valley Forge. When the soldiers were literally starving, Washington would have them tied to a tree and mercilessly flogged for stealing food from local farmers. The only way they could endure the terrible pain was by biting on a lead bullet, hence the origin of that still popular expression. And yet, despite these punishingly high standards, or maybe because of them, the soldiers learned to like and respect and then love and revere George Washington. It is an enduring lesson in leadership. Never pander to people, but always lift them up to your own high level. Now, whatever his deficiencies as a general, Washington was a genius as a politician. In fact, I would say he was peerless in our history as a vote-getter. Okay, consider this stunning record. June 1775, George Washington was unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. May 1787, he was unanimously elected President of the Constitutional Convention. And then he was elected not once but twice President of the United States by unanimous votes in the Electoral College. And that, mind you, without a single focus group or pollster or political action committee whispering in his ear. This was just George Washington responding to his own extraordinary political instincts. I think we can all agree that this was a political record that will never be equaled by any other American politician. So why did he get to amass such power? I think he amassed such power because he never seemed to be grasping for it. And this enabled people to repose the most extraordinary trust and confidence in him. Far from glorying in power, Washington seemed humbled by power. He seemed almost burdened by the weight of it. And of course, the more reluctant he appeared to come out of retirement and lead the country anew, the more the country kept clamoring to have him back. I think that Washington's presence in Philadelphia in 1787 was absolutely vital. You probably know the Constitutional Convention was held behind closed doors, and Washington's position at the helm reassured that potentially skittish public outside that no sinister plot was being hatched within. There was a widespread assumption among the delegates that Washington would be the first president, and I think that emboldened them to create a powerful office of the presidency, despite their very natural fears of a reversion to monarchy. And remember, we had just spent 8.5 years fighting a war against abuses of executive authority. It was Washington who convinced the delegates that, in fact, the president could responsibly exercise great power. Washington shaped the office of the presidency, and I really think that we live with his legacy to this day. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, most of the delegates at Philadelphia hoped that Congress, as the branch of government closest to the people, would be the preeminent branch of government. That's why if you open up the Constitution, you see Article 1 is not about the president, it's about the Congress, and there's a very long list of enumerated powers. If you then turn to Article 2, which is about the presidency, it's rather short and vague. But having dealt with this ramshackle Congress during the Revolutionary War, Washington knew that it was only the president who could spearhead domestic and foreign policy. You know, this beautiful system that we have of checks and balances and separation of powers, all these critical constitutional safeguards can also potentially be a prescription for political paralysis. Maybe we're seeing that today. Only the president, Washington saw, could give vigor and direction to this wonderful but rather cumbersome apparatus. Washington also created a cabinet. You know, there's no mention in the Constitution of a cabinet. There's only a single passing reference to reports by departmental heads. And Washington creates a cabinet. He not only creates it, he sets a benchmark for brilliant appointees that has never been topped. Okay, let us read off the honor roll. Washington had Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury. He had Henry Knox as his Secretary of War, and he had Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State. Pound for pound, I think you'll all agree, the greatest cabinet ever. It's like he had assembled the American all-star team. Like all great executives, Washington never hesitated to hire people who were smarter than he was, and he felt confident that he could control this team of headstrong prima donnas. Washington did not have the original mind for crafting a constitution or originating political programs, but he had a great reactive genius. And if more original minds like a Hamilton or a Jefferson presented him with ideas, it was Washington who had the great judgment to pick the best idea, and his judgment was almost infallible. Now, of course, you probably all know the story of what happened about the vicious political infighting that sprang up between Hamilton and Jefferson during Washington's first term. This led to the formation of the first political parties. Jefferson would remember how he and Hamilton were, quote, daily pitted in the cabinet like two fighting cocks. The fighting between them really became bitter, venomous. Washington pleaded with both men to end what he called the wounding suspicions and irritating charges that they were leveling against each other. But interestingly enough, how Washington wanted an end to their partisan venom, he was not looking for ideological uniformity in his cabinet. He retained a firm belief in the free interplay of ideas so long as things remained civil, a plea to which he would return in his farewell address when he would say the more bitter our differences in opinion, the more important that we maintain a benign and civilized discourse. Now, I know that at the moment we're all feeling rather disenchanted with our political leaders, and so we gaze back with some nostalgia to the founding era. Indeed, it was a golden age of brilliant and erudite statesmen. Imagine having a Hamilton, a Madison, and Jay simultaneously collaborating on the Federalist Papers. Nothing like that around today. But the founders, remember, were highly argumentative and opinionated people. And alas, they took keen pleasure in attacking each other. Let me give you a few examples. Their tongues could be very, very sharp. John Adams said that Alexander Hamilton was, quote, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Hamilton, who, of course, gave as good as he got, said of Adams, the man is more mad than ever I thought him, and I shall soon be let to say, as wicked as he is mad. Adams said of Benjamin Franklin that, quote, his entire life has been one continued insult to good manners and decency. Franklin, of course, no slouch in the humor department, repaid the compliment. Franklin said of Adams, he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. Now, amidst all of this name-calling and partisan bickering, it was Washington alone who rose magnificently above the fray and again showed that extraordinary clarity of vision that had made him the ideal wartime leader. You know, Washington established so many enduring traditions of the presidency, it's very easy to take for granted his gigantic influence. I mean, take the matter of presidential inaugurations. You know, in the Constitution, all it says is that the president has to take the oath of office, period. It was Washington who decided that the ceremony should be held in the open air before a multitude of citizens. It was Washington who decided that the president should take the oath with his hand on a Bible. And it was Washington who decided that the president should deliver a broadly thematic inaugural address free of policy specifics. Similarly, when Washington stepped down at the end of 2 terms, he established a precedent that lasted until FDR, of course, was elected four times, the final time during emergency wartime conditions. But so powerful was the Washington president that just 6 years after FDR died, we enacted the 22nd Amendment, limiting the president to 2 terms in office. So in the end, the Washington precedent triumphed after all. Let me touch briefly on 2 other topics that are indispensable, I think, to understanding Washington. The marriage to Martha, however romantic it was or wasn't at the outset, it certainly ripened over time into a very deep friendship. It gave Washington financial security. When they married, Martha was the richest widow in Virginia. It gave Washington emotional support. Washington was a reserved man who needed that one special confidant, which Martha was, and gave him a social setting. Washington was a cordial host, but of a rather detached sort. Martha was much more socially skillful in terms of putting people at their ease. Short, Martha Washington gave her husband the sort of warm, stable home life that enabled her husband to achieve these monumental feats. In my book, I tried to give a complete portrait of this very remarkable partnership and the indescribable sacrifices that both of them made for their country. You know, I'd noticed in so many books it says that Martha would visit George in winter quarters during the war. But those visits were not passing visits. They always stretched into the spring, 5 or 6 months. Martha Washington spent a full half of the Revolutionary War with the Continental Army. This is saying something because she was very jittery being in a war zone, and she tended to jump when the cannon boomed. Now, finally, to flesh out that private man, as I said, always lurking behind the public facade, I also wanted to devote an enormous amount of space in the book to Washington as a slaveholder. In earlier generations, biographers seemed to deem it a minor fact that George Washington owned 300 human beings. He was deeply conflicted over slavery. He opposed it in theory. Certainly after the Revolutionary War, when he was exposed to, on his staff, he had young Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette, abolitionists both. But Washington was never able to make a public issue of it in practice. You see, even in the founding era, slavery was the most divisive issue, and George Washington, as the symbol of national unity, knew that he could only broach that topic at his peril. You know, James Madison once said that the major split at the Constitutional Convention was not between the large states and the small states, which is very often the way we're taught it in school, but between the northern states and the southern states. And that split really hinged on the issue of slavery. I wanted to write a book to the extent that it was possible from existing sources in which Washington's slaves were not simply, faceless names mentioned in passing, but I wanted to try to recreate them as full-blooded human beings. To that end, I tried to bring to life his wonderful valet, Billy Lee, who accompanied him throughout the Revolutionary War and who was a marvelous hunter, rider, raconteur, or Ona Judge, who was a skilled seamstress, Martha's favorite, who later escaped to freedom in New Hampshire, or the flamboyant Hercules, who was the master chef in the presidential household, who also slipped off to freedom at the end of Washington's second term. Slaves constructed every inch of Mount Vernon. They formed the basis of Washington's fortune, and I thought that they deserved a central place in this saga. Now, what I love about George Washington is not that he was a perfect human being. Nobody is. But he was capable of constant growth and self-criticism, nowhere more than on the slavery issue. Remember, he was born into a world in Virginia where slavery was unfortunately both commonplace and unquestioned. But by the end of his life, in his will, and he wrote that will alone, in his will he performed his single most visionary act. He became the only founder to free those slaves under his direct legal control. This was an enlightened act that, had it been widely imitated, might have spared us a terrible civil war 60 years later. Now, I know that a speech on George Washington should not last as long as either the French and Indian War or the Revolutionary War. I'm also aware that there's kind of major business going on in this arena with the basketball tournament tonight. So I will stop here. Thank you for being such a lovely audience, and hope that many of you will be able to come over and continue the conversation during the Q&A period. Thank you.
This BYU Forum address with Ron Chernow was given on March 19, 2013.